Trump did not whisper it. He did not float it as a policy paper, he said it plainly. He wants Canada's water, not cooperation. Not conservation partnerships, not shared infrastructure planning. He wants access to the Great Lakes as if they were a reservoir waiting to be tapped for American shortages. He described Canadian rivers as a faucet, as if the largest freshwater system on the planet were a plumbing fixture that could simply be turned south. And Mark Carney answered with a line that did not bend. Water is not negotiable, not for sale, not a bargaining chip in trade talks. Not compensation for tariffs, not leverage in a political feud. Canadian water belongs to Canada, period. That was not said in Ottawa behind closed doors. It was said at Davos in front of the global financial elite, investors, heads of state, energy executives, sovereign wealth funds. Carney did not frame it as defiance, he framed it as sovereignty. And that is what Washington did not expect, because this is not just about water. It is about control over the economic engine of the Great Lakes Basin, a region generating trillions in output, powering manufacturing, energy production, agriculture, shipping, and data infrastructure on both sides of the border. A region so large that if it stood alone, it would rival the biggest economies on Earth, and water is the bloodstream of that engine. The American West is drying. That is not rhetoric. It is measurable. The Colorado River no longer carries the volume assumed when water rights were divided a century ago. Lake Mead has hovered near critical thresholds. Lake Powell has flirted with levels that threaten hydroelectric output. 40 million Americans depend on a river system built on outdated hydrological assumptions. Agricultural fields in California's Central Valley have been fallowed. Municipal restrictions have become permanent rather than seasonal. Power generation tied to reservoir levels is increasingly uncertain. So when Trump looks north and sees the Great Lakes, holding roughly 1/5 of the world's surface freshwater, he sees abundance. He sees stability. He sees a resource that could ease political pressure in drought-stricken states. But what he does not see, or refuses to acknowledge, is that the Great Lakes are not surplus inventory. They are embedded in an ecosystem of industry that depends on predictable levels, stable governance, and by national management structures more than a century old. 8 American states border the Great Lakes. 2 Canadian provinces anchor the northern shoreline. Millions of people draw drinking water directly from the basin. Manufacturing plants use it for cooling and processing. Power stations withdraw and return it under tightly regulated systems. Cargo vessels move iron ore, grain, and industrial inputs across inland seas that feed supply chains stretching from Minnesota to New York and from Ontario to Ohio. Every gallon is accounted for in a delicate balance. There is a reason the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Compact prohibits large-scale diversions outside the basin. The rule is simple: water stays where it originates. That agreement was not written lightly. It was drafted after decades of recognizing that once diversion begins, precedent becomes pressure. If water flows to one drought state, others will demand the same. If one pipeline is approved, political arguments multiply. And once infrastructure exists, it rarely disappears. Carney understands that dynamic, so his refusal was immediate and absolute. But here is where the story deepens. At the same moment Trump floated the idea of revisiting water-sharing frameworks, Carney unveiled a $1 trillion domestic infrastructure acceleration plan. Energy transmission lines linking provinces, critical mineral processing facilities, data centers built to power artificial intelligence workloads, expanded electricity generation, modernized pipelines, all of it water-intensive. Artificial intelligence infrastructure requires massive cooling capacity. Data centers draw millions of gallons daily in closed-loop systems. Mineral processing facilities use water in separation and refinement. Hydrogen production requires electrolysis. Even renewable energy installations rely on manufacturing supply chains tied to water-based industrial processes. Carney's message was subtle but unmistakable. Canada is going to use its water to power its own transformation. And that is the move Washington did not anticipate because leverage assumes dependency. For decades, the assumption inside parts of Washington was that Canada's economic alignment was automatic. That integration meant compliance, that shared infrastructure implied asymmetrical influence. But water is not oil, it is not lumber, it is not a commodity easily substituted or priced in global markets. It is jurisdictional, it is ecological, it is existential. You cannot tariff water, you cannot sanction rainfall. You cannot pressure a watershed into compliance. And more importantly, you cannot compel a sovereign nation to divert freshwater resources without triggering constitutional, provincial, environmental, and international legal barriers. Canada controls the northern halves of Lake Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Provincial authority in Ontario and Quebec governs extraction and use on that side. Federal environmental law overlays it. The International Joint Commission exists precisely to manage shared concerns, but it does not grant unilateral extraction rights. Trump's framing treats water as if it were excess capacity waiting for political negotiation. In reality, the Great Lakes Basin economy depends on water remaining in place. Manufacturing corridors across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois draw on stable water levels for predictable operations. Steel plants, automotive assembly lines, chemical processors, food production facilities, they all assume basin integrity. Even modest level changes alter shoreline infrastructure, shipping drafts, and ecological balance, and here is the strategic paradox. If the United States were to aggressively pursue diversion, it would destabilize the very basin economy that anchors Midwestern industry. The same states that rely on Canadian trade and integrated supply chains would face ecological and economic uncertainty. Which is why governors in the basin tread carefully. They understand that the Great Lakes economy is not an American asset to be commanded. It is a shared system requiring trust that Canada will manage its side responsibly. Trust that the United States will respect basin boundaries. Trust that water governance will not become a bargaining chip in tariff disputes. When Trump disinvited Canadian representatives from Great Lakes meetings over procedural disagreements, it sent a signal: cooperation was conditional. Carney's response was not theatrical. It was infrastructural: build out domestic grids. Expand mineral processing, anchor data infrastructure within Canadian borders. Use Canadian water to power Canadian economic expansion. That approach does not threaten confrontation, it makes confrontation irrelevant. Because the more Canada internalizes value creation around its own resource base, the less exposed it becomes to rhetorical pressure from Washington. Water is the core of that strategy. And once a nation builds long-term capital projects around a resource, that resource becomes politically untouchable. Trump may have expected negotiation. What he triggered was consolidation. And the implications ripple outward into the entire Great Lakes economy. The Great Lakes economy is not a regional footnote. It is one of the largest integrated economic zones on the planet. Manufacturing output across the basin rivals major national economies. Automotive production alone depends on constant cross-border movement of components that may cross the water multiple times before a vehicle is complete. Steel flows, grain ships, energy circulates, cooling systems hum. All of it anchored to freshwater stability. The basin supports tens of millions of jobs. Ports move hundreds of millions of tons of cargo annually. Nuclear stations withdraw enormous volumes for cooling before returning it safely under regulatory limits. Municipal systems distribute drinking water to dense urban corridors stretching from Chicago to Toronto. The entire structure assumes one foundational principle: the lakes remain intact. If water becomes a bargaining tool, that assumption fractures. And that fracture would not only affect Canada. American industrial states rely on cooperative water management. They rely on Canadian data sharing for ice conditions, invasive species monitoring, water level forecasting, and environmental control. The International Joint Commission exists because unilateral management is impossible in a shared watershed. Threatening diversion introduces instability. Instability discourages investment. Investors building billion-dollar facilities in the basin require regulatory clarity over decades, not election cycles. If water governance becomes politicized, capital hesitates, long-term projects stall. Carney's trillion-dollar strategy anticipates that hesitation and turns it into opportunity. Instead of reacting to American pressure, Canada is front-loading investment. Electricity transmission lines linking provinces reduce reliance on American interconnections. Mineral refinement facilities ensure raw resources are processed domestically rather than exported for value capture elsewhere. Data centers anchored in Ontario and Quebec leverage hydropower and freshwater cooling to attract global technology firms. Every one of those projects deepens Canada's internal economic gravity. And gravity matters because economic gravity determines leverage. If Canada's growth trajectory becomes less dependent on American market access and more diversified globally, rhetorical threats lose potency. If domestic processing of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements scales inside Canada, those industries become self-reinforcing. Water is the quiet enabler of all of it. Artificial intelligence infrastructure requires reliable cooling capacity. The global race to host AI workloads is constrained by electricity and water. Jurisdictions with abundant fresh water and clean power become magnets for data infrastructure. Ontario's proximity to the Great Lakes provides both. Critical mineral extraction similarly depends on water-intensive processing. Carney's strategy of refining domestically rather than shipping concentrate abroad keeps that industrial activity and the jobs tied to it inside Canadian borders. This is not merely environmental stewardship, it is industrial strategy. Trump's assumption appears rooted in traditional leverage models: identify resource abundance, apply political pressure, extract concessions. But those models work when the targeted resource holder lacks alternatives or domestic integration. Canada now has both, and here lies the shock to Washington. Because the Great Lakes region within the United States also depends on Canada. Cross-border automotive production is integrated to the point that parts can cross the boundary multiple times before final assembly. Energy markets in parts of the Midwest interconnect with Canadian grids. Natural gas pipelines move in both directions. Electricity flows north and south depending on seasonal demand. Water management cooperation underpins those interactions. If Washington escalates pressure on diversion, Ottawa can respond not with confrontation, but with strategic slowdown in cooperative areas that require goodwill. Not violation of treaties, not illegal obstruction. Simply prioritization of domestic investment over cross-border accommodation. Even subtle recalibrations alter outcomes. If Canadian energy infrastructure increasingly prioritizes east-west domestic transmission rather than north-south export, American utilities lose optionality. If mineral processing scales internally, U.S. manufacturers reliant on raw exports face higher acquisition costs or supply negotiations. None of this requires public hostility, it requires planning. And that planning is already underway. The brilliance and danger of Carney's move is that it reframes sovereignty through infrastructure rather than speeches. Infrastructure lasts decades. It locks in patterns of production and trade that outlive administrations. Water diversion proposals, by contrast, are politically volatile and environmentally explosive. The governors of Great Lakes states understand that any large-scale diversion outside the basin threatens water levels, shoreline stability, and ecological balance. Even minor reductions alter shipping drafts. Lower drafts reduce cargo capacity. Reduced cargo capacity raises transport costs. Higher costs ripple through steel, agriculture, and manufacturing. The basin economy is delicately calibrated, and that calibration depends on trust that both federal governments respect the compact. If Washington appears willing to override that trust for short-term political leverage, regional leaders push back, because their states bear the consequences. This is the undercurrent Washington cannot ignore. Trump's framing may resonate politically in drought-stricken states desperate for solutions. But in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Illinois, and New York, the calculation is different. Those economies are not seeking diversion. They are seeking stability. Carney's refusal provides that stability. It signals that Canada will not destabilize the basin for political appeasement. It reassures investors that cross-border governance remains grounded in law rather than rhetoric. It protects ecological balance while simultaneously channeling freshwater advantage into domestic growth. And that combination, ecological preservation plus industrial acceleration, alters negotiating dynamics. Because once Canada commits water capacity to internal AI infrastructure, mineral processing, and energy systems, surplus perception disappears. Water becomes fully allocated within national planning models. At that point, diversion is not only politically unacceptable, it is economically impractical. Trump may have expected pushback followed by bargaining. Instead, he encountered structural repositioning. The Great Lakes remain shared, cooperation continues. But Canada's trajectory now tilts towards self-reinforced growth powered by its own resource base. The paradox is striking. The more aggressively Washington presses for access, the more incentive Ottawa has to internalize value creation. The more internalized value creation becomes, the less room remains for external extraction. And once independence reaches infrastructural scale, it is not easily reversed. Water stays in the basin, investment stays in Canada. And the $6 trillion Great Lakes economy continues operating, but with a subtle shift in gravitational center. Not through confrontation, through independence. And independence, once embedded in steel, concrete, transmission lines, and processing plants, does not negotiate itself away.